Hello and welcome to the Taxcast from the Tax Justice Network with me, Naomi Fowler. Coming up later.
Competition is declining. The idea that some of these industries that we see are truly capitalist is not true in the sense that you don't have genuine competition.
We talk about Oligopoly Capitalism with author Jonathan Tepper. Are we living through the last stage of capitalism? This month, the World Economic Forum takes place in Davos, where politicians have scorned the idea of wealth taxes. Oxfam always releases its latest global wealth report to coincide with Davos. Their latest report has 2018 as a year when wealth inequality continued to explode. Apparently, the 26 richest billionaires now own as much as 3.8 billion people, who are the poorest half of the planet's population, while that poorest half saw their wealth fall even further by 11%. 2,200 billionaires increased theirs by $2.5 billion a day. We're going to talk to the Tax Justice Network's John Christensen now for his take on this month. OK, John, we've got booming corporate profits at the moment, yet rising inequality levels, and that means that what we need is visionary, principled politics. And in the United States, I'm very glad to say that we've got the youngest woman ever who's been elected to serve in the Congress, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who is proving the point about why we need younger people in politics. And she's proposing a 70% top marginal tax rate on incomes once they get to $10 million and above. We've seen wealth levels soaring for the super rich since the 1980s. Their tax rates have been dropping and dropping, while incomes of ordinary people have just been stagnating. So we've seen a straight wealth transfer from the majority to a tiny, tiny minority. And let's face it, after your first 10 million comes into your bank account each year, do you really need more than that? What a great proposal, isn't it?
Yeah, we've waited decades for this moment. That is the moment when a politician actually dares to expose one of the most pernicious myths of the past half-century. Ever since the 1970s, when economists who call themselves supply-side economists or supply-siders claimed that the best way to boost investment was to cut taxes on the wealthy and to reduce the corporate tax rates, politicians have been treating this as a holy mantra. I should add, not every politician. The recently deceased President George W.H. Bush called this voodoo economics. But really since the 1980s, even supposedly progressive politicians in the Democratic Party and in left-of-centre parties across the world have been absolutely transfixed by this seductive notion that cutting taxes for the rich will pay back with even more tax revenue than you had before. Sounds too good to be true, and blow me, it was too good to be true. And most people, frankly, have seen the tax cuts for exactly what they were, which is giveaways to the rich people. So within days of taking office, Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez blew the whole myth away just like a puff of smoke, and the supply-side devotees and the television pundits in the United States just went mad. Fox News, for example, described her proposal as the most radical and destructive policy proposal in decades. What she was suggesting was that anyone receiving income above $10 million a year would need to pay a top income tax rate of somewhere between 60 to 70% on that income over $10 million a year. Income below that level would be charged at the current prevailing tax rates, which in the United States currently is 37%. But still, her proposal was dismissed as madness. But consider this. In 1952, at the start of the period which many people call the Golden Age of Capitalism, which saw the longest period of sustained growth and income inequality in recent history, at that time the top income tax rate was 92%. And that rate was applied to income above $200,000 a year. During World War II, the top rate was even higher. It was set at 94%, and rich people were expected to pay that rate as a patriotic duty. And guess what? Even Republican presidents like Eisenhower and Richard Nixon not to mention Democratic presidents like Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. They all thought the top rate on really high income earners was entirely justified at well over 60%, in fact well over 70% for most of that time. Now the important thing to recognise here, and the Congresswoman was very careful to explain this, is that the top rate only applies above the $10 million threshold. So high-income earners still enjoy the same tax treatments as everybody else below that threshold. They even enjoy zero tax on the first $10,000 or so dollars of income. And I use the word income or earned income with a bit of caution, because most people with incomes over $10 million a year probably don't earn it. They probably receive it as unearned income from rents of one kind or another. Now, anyone listening to radio and TV programs in the US will probably have come away with the impression that Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez made suggestions which fly completely in the face of all economic wisdom. Well, that's just not the case. In fact, the 60 to 70% tax rate she suggests falls well within the range that leading United States economists describe as the optimal tax rate. That's the rate at which a particular tax generates sufficient tax revenue to achieve the government's goal without causing excessive distortion or inefficiencies in the wider economy. In the US, you have leading economists, for example, Peter Diamond, who's won a Nobel laureate for his work on tax, and Emmanuel Saez. They estimate the optimal tax rate on income is 73%, even higher than the range suggested by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. And another leading US economist, Christina Roma, has suggested the optimal tax rate is even higher than 80%, way beyond the level that the Congresswoman was suggesting. So, judging on the latest economic thinking, the Congresswoman was entirely right, and what I'm hoping is that from now on, we'll never hear again from lazy politicians that tax cuts for the rich are good for the economy. They quite simply aren't.
So, yes, Sweden's got a top marginal tax rate of almost 70%, and that kicks in at salaries way earlier than Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is proposing, at salaries of $79,000 and above. And there's absolutely no stifling of economic growth there. The employment rate's higher than in the United States, and its economy's outdone the United States so far this decade. So there you go. As well as economic reforms, investment in public services, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is proposing major investment in a Green New Deal, which is a plan to transform the US economy and tackle the climate crisis, much needed. And the enormity of what's needed in the US, a lot could be funded by this higher marginal tax rate. It's also where Keynesian monetary theory and policies could come in, and that's a Taxcast all on its own, about how nation states who have their own currencies can create money. We're going to be talking about that on the Taxcast soon, and how that relates to tax justice, because it comes up a lot, and there's a lot of misunderstandings about it. But we know that these things can be done, because things like the National Health Service was set up when Britain was absolutely broke after the Second World War, and in 1933 President Roosevelt found the money to finance his New Deal, which was so critical to tackling unemployment and poverty at the time. So it can be done.
Yeah, not only can it be done, it needs to be done, because we're facing a potential catastrophe if we don't address this. Government really does need to take the lead, and the government can fund it from a variety of sources. You mentioned Keynesian demand management. There is no question the government could quite simply create the money to invest in something as important as this gigantic energy transition that we have to fund to move away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy types. But also a tax hike could play a part in all of this process. And this is the kind of visionary thinking that's needed, not just in the United States, but across the world, if we're to make this transition. The idea of a Green New Deal will need to be picked up across the world, but I'd like to see the United States pick up on this, partly because the United States is so far behind the rest of the world in this energy transition. It doesn't even come within the top 15 countries on energy efficiency, and it's still highly reliant upon the fossil fuel industry. So the Green New Deal that Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez is suggesting could be potentially transformative, not just in terms of the potential for tackling climate change, but also for the potential for creating huge numbers of new jobs for fairly skilled and well-paid workers who, for example, can work in, improving housing and insulation and building a new renewable sector. It's precisely this kind of thinking that's needed to give the world the hope that will actually lead on to higher levels of private sector investment. There's lots that can be done, and it's great to have this kind of visionary thinking coming through at the moment.
Oh, yes, indeed. It's going to be interesting to watch. Right, so moving on, you've just come back from speaking in the European Parliament on the impact of Brexit on tax evasion and money laundering. We've avoided Brexit for a while on the Taxcast, but we can no longer. You can read John's notes for his speech on the Tax Justice Network website with the title Brexit and the Future of Tax Havens. We've discussed before the push behind Brexit to develop Britain even further along the lines of a tax haven economy than it already is. We know that the City of London relies on its satellite havens, the overseas territories and crown dependencies, to do much of the dirty work before it gets to London. And you made some recommendations on how the EU should proceed in handling the UK's banking industry in terms of whether or not to grant London's finance sector full rights when it's probably not going to be operating within the single market, and if it's such a serious offender already in terms of secrecy and all sorts of other monkey business. And key to your recommendations is that if tax haven blacklists are really serious, then Britain and all of its secrecy jurisdiction territories should be included on the EU's blacklist. And not only that, but Britain's tax haven empire, the whole thing, should be treated as a single entity and judged on the score of its lowest common denominator, which is currently the Turks and Caicos Islands, with a financial secrecy index score of 77 out of 100.
Well, that's right, and I think the European Union needs to pay a great deal of attention to this, partly because Prime Minister Theresa May and many of her cabinet ministers have been talking about a possible post-Brexit scenario where Britain, which is already one of the world's leading and most toxic money laundering centres and tax havens, will adopt a policy which they've been calling Singapore-on-Thames, which means even more tax haven activity and even darker secrecy. So I was saying that if the City of London is to have access to the European single market, it won't have access on the basis of passporting rights, which allow the banks simply to go there and trade as they have whilst Britain's been a member of the European Union. What they're hoping for is what's called equivalence. And equivalence means equal treatment of regulations, laws and compliance practices in Britain to regulations, laws and compliance practices within the single market. And my view is that this simply shouldn't be the case. And I'm arguing this partly because if you look at the UK itself in isolation, its secrecy score is relatively good, in the mid-40s. And that compares well with quite a number of European Union countries. But if you look at Britain's ecosystem of tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions, its crown dependencies and its overseas territories, what you see is they all interact. The banks, the law firms and the accounting firms operating out of London use these crown dependencies and overseas territories to create complex structures across the whole ecosystem of tax havens. And for that reason, the vulnerabilities are very high indeed. What I suggested to the European Parliament is that before they even consider granting equivalent treatment, they should do what's called a spillover analysis. They should look at the laws and the regulations and the compliance procedures in every single British territory, secrecy jurisdictions and tax havens, and treat the whole ecosystem as a single entity and assess on the basis of the weakest link within that ecosystem, which, as you say, it is the Turks and Caicos. On that basis, there's no way they could possibly or should grant equivalent treatment on the UK. Now, the advantage of doing this is it puts enormous pressure on the UK, not only to improve the regulations and the compliance within London itself, but also to take action against their overseas territories and crown dependencies, all of which have so far, for example, refused to comply with requests to make their registries of company ownership and trust ownership available on public record. They've simply refused. And the UK has not required them to adopt public registries, and that's a political choice taken in London.
Thanks, John. John Christensen of the Tax Justice Network. Now it's time for the Taxcast special feature. This month we take a look at the era that we're all living in of monopoly capitalism, or oligopoly capitalism. And we've said before that it's as serious a threat for our economies and for tax justice and for democracy as tax havens and financial secrecy. Let's take the United States as an example, where just 2 health insurers have got an 80 to 90% share of the market, 4 companies control the entire beef market, 5 banks control about half of that nation's banking assets, Google's got almost a 90% market share of all internet searches, and Facebook has got an almost 80% share when it comes to social networks. It's bad.
Competition is declining. The idea that some of these industries that we see are truly capitalist is not true, in the sense that you don't have genuine competition.
This month I'm talking with investor and author Jonathan Tepper, who's co-written a book called The Myth of Capitalism, Monopolies and the Death of Capitalism. Let's start with what might seem an unrelated issue, which Jonathan uses as an example of what's going so badly wrong. You may or may not remember there was an incident a couple of years ago when an airline passenger on a plane was violently dragged from his seat and taken off the plane by police in Chicago, to the horror of his fellow passengers. The airline had double booked his seat. The plane was waiting to go and he was refusing to leave because, apart from the fact that he paid to be on that flight, it turned out he was also a doctor with patients he needed to treat the other end. The whole thing was filmed by fellow passengers and it went viral afterwards. It's not pleasant to listen to, but I'm playing an excerpt here because I think it's important to get across how badly he was treated. If you don't want to hear it, you can skip the next 20 seconds from this point.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! No! Guys, my God! What are you doing? No, this is wrong! Oh my God! Look at what you did to him! Oh my God!
That's pretty horrible listening. So what does this tell us about oligopoly capitalism? Well, Jonathan points out in his book that nowadays in the United States there are only 4 major airline companies that dominate the skies. In close to half of the US's largest airports, only 1 airline controls most of the market. And the point here is that treating customers with respect and fairness seems to become less necessary because genuine market choice for consumers is shrinking. So they pretty much have to use the same airline a lot of the time. Jonathan, can you tell me why you chose to use this particular incident with United Airlines as an example in your book? It's kind of a metaphor.
I picked that example because the incident itself, in the days following the event, the newspapers were recommending people buy airline stocks because the airline industry had turned into an oligopoly. And so they were saying that, in fact, there was a headline, which is what sort of startled me, and it said, airlines can treat you like trash because they're an oligopoly. And so having this power over consumers was viewed as a positive thing, and the stock went up rather than down when people started focusing on the fact that you couldn't really avoid United if you wanted to. And so it sort of turned everything on its head, where now being able to brutalize a customer is viewed as a good thing if you can get away with it.
Right. The passenger was eventually compensated by the airline, but United's dominant market share is a great metaphor for capitalism and where we're at in many countries. And so much of this comes down really to the fundamental issue around the role of governments and big state versus small state. And you write about the government, and when it comes to commerce, the government is the referee, and you need a referee and a set of sensible rules for a good basketball game. And this is the big battle at the moment. And if you add climate crisis to the mix, government's never been more important, and yet we have accelerated inequality, workers not benefiting from record corporate profits. It's a really worrying time.
Yes, so I do think that markets really are a construct of common law, a tradition in society. And so the idea that somehow markets exist independent of us as citizens is ridiculous. And I think that we need to have as free and fair a competition as possible, and government is required in order to make sure that's possible. Monopolists can and do abuse their positions to squeeze workers and suppliers, and also to enact laws and regulations that favor them. And so I think that antitrust and thoughtful regulation has a very different and important part to play in markets.
Yes. And for European listeners, by the way, antitrust laws are all about regulating to ensure fair competition and making sure big cartels, big firms don't abuse the market with their monopoly positions and fixed prices. One of the Tax Justice Network's big concerns is the power that multinational companies have to influence tax policy and the amount of tax they pay, which is so badly eroding the post-Second World War social gains that had been made in terms of human rights provisions, poverty, hunger, homelessness, access to healthcare, education, which have all been sliding backwards. And these huge concentrated interests are really transforming politics and the role of the state and its relationship with citizens.
I think that that's certainly correct. And, if you are a small business, you don't get almost any tax benefits. You can't shift your income to sort of the Caymans or to Bermuda. You can't do, the shenanigans that are done with Ireland, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. The big multinationals can do that, and they shift all their income to places where they pay lower or no taxes. Mysteriously, all their employees in higher tax jurisdictions are cost centers. They're not actually doing anything for the business, and so they take advantage of transfer pricing. And this is an enormous problem. Almost any worldwide income can get shifted through tax havens. One of the big problems, I think, with big tech, which is that they essentially, in many cases, are bigger than governments. If you look at, Facebook essentially has about as many users as there are Christians in the world. And so it's like, a major religion, effectively, in terms of the size. And in many ways, it's sort of outside of the scope of national governments in terms of sort of regulation and taxation.
And big tech companies are among the worst. The Googles, the Amazons, the Facebooks. Well, I'm putting an S on it, but I don't know why. And you write that currently these platforms appear to be benign dictators, but they are dictators nonetheless. And it's very dangerous for democracy, as we've seen with Facebook being so easily hijacked to influence elections and by advertising space and dark money channels and all the rest of it. The internet is on the front line of all that's going wrong as well, isn't it?
Yes. So Tim Berners-Lee is one of the creators of the World Wide Web, where he established the standards and protocols, and that's how we ended up with browsers and much of what we have today. And he thinks that the internet itself is dying, and he's working on a project to try to save it. And what I point out in the book is that the internet was meant to be an open, free, and anarchic place, and instead what it's become is essentially a highly centralized system where Facebook and Google control over half and close to 70% of the referral traffic on the internet. And so, what gets found and seen is really down to two companies. And that's not what the internet was about. In the 1990s and early 2000s, if you had a blog, I had a blog, I could link to yours, you could link to mine, and then, you could link to someone else's. And so you ended up with a very rich patchwork of links. And the internet was meant to be free and open, and now essentially it's become highly centralized. And the problem is that they have algorithms at Facebook and Google, and they're basically to drive engagement. They're not really meant to be true or accurate. And I talk about in the book that it's one of the greatest arbitrages in history, where reporters and content creators spend time and energy creating content, and then Google and Facebook are the ones that profit from this.
Right, and you talk about how oligopolies suppress innovation and creativity as well. You talk about the collapse in the rate of startups. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Certainly. So in the last 20 years, what we've seen is the number of public companies in the United States is halved. So you have half the number of companies trading on the NYSE or NASDAQ. And, clearly this is not a good thing. The economy's been growing tremendously since then, over a 20-year period, yet we have far fewer companies. And it's not just public companies, but rather we have private companies as well. We've seen a collapse of new entrants at the same time as the number of exits have stayed relatively stable. And for quite a few years after the financial crisis, we had more exits than entries. So, if you looked at this as a human population, this would be deeply concerning if you had sort of more people dying than were being born. And unfortunately, that's the situation in which we find ourselves.
Right. And also what's happening is the biggies tend to swallow up the small and emerging companies that aren't failing to compete. And what we're tending to see is innovation efforts focused on things like tax dodging schemes, dividends to shareholders, share buyback schemes. Genuine invention and creativity's gone out of a window.
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of work that's been done. The most important work was by Thomas Philippon, who's a French economist. But basically what we've seen is the rise in industrial concentration has led to a decline in investment, and it would be higher if markets were less concentrated. And so you end up with a collapse in startups, but you also end up with less investment. And you highlighted the role of acquisitions. In some cases, this is tax-driven. If you think of particularly the U.S. companies, which have normally held money abroad and not repatriated it, often it made sense to use those cash hoards abroad to buy companies and then integrate them into, whether it was Google or Facebook. And that was one way to minimize the tax bill, which was to use the money abroad.
Right, and another very serious knock-on effect as well that we're seeing is this suppression of wages. It's been going on for some time now, and that's very worrying because obviously capitalism's going to eat itself, really, because if no one has enough money to buy anything, it just doesn't work.
So Henry Ford recognized this, which is why he raised wages for employees. It is important, obviously. A society in which only the very wealthy do well is not one that tends to lead towards social stability. And so I think that if you are on the left or the right, I think it makes sense to reform to make sure that we don't end up with an upheaval or a genuine revolution. And so in the conclusion to the book, I talk about Edmund Burke, and the paradox is that the essence of conservatism is reform. If you don't reform, then the old order gets swept away. We clearly do need reforms, and we need to make sure that wages can be set competitively.
Right, and you talk about situation of monopsony. That's a market situation where there's only one buyer. So applying that to a company that has a near or total monopoly, it can get away with low wages. Can you explain that?
Yes. When you look at one company as a seller, that's called a monopoly. But when you have essentially one company as a buyer, that's a monopsony. Unfortunately, many markets for labor in the United States are increasingly concentrated and monopsonistic. And in other cases, there isn't what you could call a real monopsony, which would be, let's say, a company coal town that basically is the only buyer for labor in that town. But what you have in the U.S., 1 in 5 workers faces non-competes, and these are a form of monopsony where the worker does not have the freedom to go and offer their labor to other companies. And so there are many different sort of ways that companies exercise power over workers, and you could call that metaphorical monopsony, which is that it's not one company facing off against, the entire industry, but rather it's one company preventing the worker from actually going out and being able to offer their labor to other companies.
Right, to what other companies? One thing I really want to ask you about is you write about monopoly being the last stage of capitalism, and that's according to Lenin. And you say we're approaching the Soviet stage in some industries. I wonder if you can explain what you mean.
Sure. So I was obviously being a little tongue-in-cheek with that statement, but I do think that if you look at many important industries, consumers don't really have a choice. And in the sort of Soviet system, the state decided when and where things were produced, and often it was one company, essentially the state itself, that was producing it, or one factory. And I recount a true story, which was that after the fall of the Soviet Union, there were riots in Moscow because there weren't enough cigarettes with, the filter tips were all made essentially in Armenia, where there was a civil war going on. And so when you decide to sort of centralize all your production in one place, you can end up with problems rather than having, multiple factories, competitors, and so on. And I'd point out in the U.S., for example, 2 companies make intravenous saline solution, and those production facilities were in Puerto Rico. And when Hurricane Maria hit, you ended up with shortages of saline solution. But there are many, many industries where consumers don't have a choice, whether it's from a high-speed internet where 75% of Americans don't have any choice at all, Or, you can look at local health insurance markets, local hospital systems, and these are not public monopolies where, the monopolist is the state doing it for the good of the people. They're not even necessarily very regulated in many cases. These are essentially sort of areas that are ripe for price gouging.
Right, price gouging, that's price fixing, cartel style. And the threat of oligopoly, monopoly capitalism really should unite the left and right politically, in concern anyway, even if it's from pretty different perspectives. Yet, mainstream politicians have been really slow to understand and take action in terms of policy proposals and reform. Why do you think that is?
I think that many of the people in power and the regulators and people enforcing laws often go through a revolving door and stand to benefit from mergers. So if you look at the new appointment that Trump's made to the Department of Justice, Barr, he was paid a few $1 million for the AT&T Time Warner deal. You don't just find this in the U.S., but you find it in many other places. And so clearly having poachers turn gamekeepers, turn poachers is one where the interest of poachers is very well looked after.
Yeah, and we need to stop that revolving door for sure. You say that we need a revolution to cast off monopolies and restore entrepreneurial freedom. And as you say, in the past 30 or 40 years, we've already had a revolution by stealth, really, with this concentration within industries with very little public debate. What kind of revolution do we need, in your view?
So I'm not advocating a violent revolution. Definitely not. No, I mean the revolution itself. To do away with antitrust laws. They call that essentially the Antitrust Revolution. Robert Bork and the Chicago School were some of the big proponents behind it, and essentially turning antitrust on its head. Saying that as long as companies create efficiency, they can merge, and that's really not at all what was intended by the Sherman Act or the Clayton Act. And so when I argue for a revolution, the end of the book has very specific proposals. I think that some of it relates to antitrust reform. Without a new act, it's difficult to get judges to change the way they're deciding laws. It's very difficult to get the FTC and the DOJ, who I think essentially are captured institutions, to enforce the laws.
That's the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission.
Yes, and I think that competition is not really just a matter of antitrust. It's also a matter of regulation. I think what we need is simpler and better, more principles-based regulations rather than extremely complex rules. And the example that I use in the book is banking reform. After the 1929 crash and the Great Depression, Glass-Steagall was passed, and that was 35 pages, and that worked very well for over 70 years. After the 2008 crash, Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act, and that was 2,200 pages with thousands more pages delegated to rule writing committees. And, under Glass-Steagall, we had many new banks start up. We've had almost no new banks start up under Dodd-Frank. So the more regulated and extensive the regulation is generally the more concentrated the industries.
And the Dodd-Frank Act was watered down too, and lobbying is a whole other issue. But I want to ask you, do you see any signs on the horizon anywhere that you draw some hope from in that these reforms might start happening?
Yes, I'm very hopeful. Well, on the one hand, I'm very hopeful because there's quite a lot of interest in reform. Certainly politically, we're hearing more and more about this in the United States, certainly, and we're seeing some in Europe. And on the other hand, I'm slightly more depressed in the sense that these reforms do take time. And so I think that the world's not going to change just because I write a book. It's going to change because many people do become politically active, and it's when you end up with an avalanche rather than just a little snowball that things change.
I've been speaking with Jonathan Tepper. You can find more information on his book, The Myth of Capitalism, Monopolies and the Death of Capitalism, on www.mythofcapitalism.com. Another great source of information is the Open Markets Institute on www.openmarketsinstitute.org. Well worth a look. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next month.